This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Just after 10:47 p.m., a frantic 911 call came from a gated estate in Hawthorne Ridge, an affluent neighborhood perched above the hills of Santa Valera, California. "My parents! Someone shot my parents!" the caller cried, his voice cracked between sobs. In the background, another young man wailed uncontrollably. Minutes later, deputies arrived at the sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion owned by Victor and Elena Navarro. What they found inside was carnage. Victor Navarro lay slumped in a reclining chair in the family room, the television still glowing blue against the walls. Elena was face down near the hallway arch, as if she had tried to escape. The attack was savage. Investigators would later describe the scene as excessive, even for a targeted killing. The violence was so extreme that identification required forensic confirmation. Upstairs, two sons waited. 22-year-old Adrian Navarro and his younger brother, 19-year-old Mateo, were hysterical. Adrian paced and shouted. Mateo collapsed onto the manicured lawn, curled in on himself, screaming into the night. On the surface, they looked like shattered sons. 7 years later, they would be convicted of murdering their parents. But that wasn't the end of the story. Because decades later, the Navarro case still dominates podcasts, streaming documentaries, and social media debates. Some insist the brothers were greedy heirs who executed their parents for money. Others argued they were victims who finally snapped after years of hidden abuse. Before we get to that, you need to understand the world they came from. The Navarros were not simply wealthy, they were ultra-wealthy. Their home at Hawthorne Ridge wasn't just large, it was an estate. Marble floors, a private tennis court, a detached guest villa, imported Italian furniture, the kind of place owned by Hollywood royalty or heavyweight champions. Victor Navarro built that empire from nothing. Born in Havana, he fled Cuba at 16 during political unrest. He arrived in Florida with limited English and no connections. What he did have was discipline and ambition. He earned an accounting degree while working nights, then pivoted into entertainment finance. By his early 40s, Victor was a senior executive at Titan Sound Group, later becoming CEO of Crescent Entertainment Holdings. He negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts, brokered music catalog deals, and built relationships with A-list celebrities. He was known for being brilliant and ruthless. Elena Navarro had once been an elementary school teacher. She left her career as Victor's success accelerated. Over time, her role shifted from educator to hostess, maintaining appearances at galas and industry dinners. To outsiders, they were the American dream in designer clothes. Adrian and Mateo grew up in that world of excess. Private schools, summer trips to Europe, courtside seats at Lakers games, tailored suits before they were old enough to drive. Adrian, charismatic and confident, was accepted into an Ivy League university on the East Coast, but within a year, disciplinary problems followed: academic dishonesty, arrogance, entitlement. Mateo was quieter, more withdrawn, but he had talent. He ranked nationally in junior tennis and trained at elite academies in Florida. Coaches believed he could go pro, possibly competing one day against stars like Pete Sampras or Andre Agassi. From the outside, everything looked aligned for generational success. By the summer of 1991, Adrian was 22, Mateo was 19. Their futures seemed secured by family wealth, influence, and opportunity. The Hawthorne estate alone was valued at over $12 million. Had life followed a different path, Victor might have told them, One day, this will all be yours. Instead, on August 14th, 1991, the brothers walked into the family room carrying 12-gauge shotguns. Victor was watching television. He never saw it coming. The first blast struck the back of his head. He died instantly. Elena, hearing the explosion, rushed toward the room. She was shot in the leg, collapsing onto polished hardwood. She tried to crawl away. The brothers reloaded. What followed was not hesitation. It was repetition. Multiple rounds fired at close range. Investigators later described it as overkill. When it was over, the silence was broken only by the hum of the television and the faint ringing in their ears. Then something chilling happened. They didn't flee. They didn't call for help. They cleaned themselves up. They changed clothes. And they left. Security footage would later show their car exiting the property less than 20 minutes after the killings. They drove to a late showing of a blockbuster film. Witnesses would remember nothing unusual about them. After the movie, they returned home. Only then did Adrian place the 911 call. The performance that followed was convincing. When deputies arrived, Mateo was on the lawn, sobbing uncontrollably. Adrian clutched his head and repeated, "Why would anyone do this?" Detectives initially considered a business motive. Victor Navarro had made enemies. High-level entertainment deals breed resentment. Organized crime wasn't out of the question. There were odd details. The kneecaps of both victims had been shot, a detail investigators sometimes associate with professional executions. Nothing had been stolen. Still, in the early days, suspicion did not immediately settle on the sons. No gunshot residue tests were administered that night. For a time, it appeared they might escape scrutiny. Then came the spending. Within weeks, Adrian purchased a $58,000 sports car, designer watches, custom suits. He invested in a trendy restaurant venture in downtown Santa Valera. Mateo hired a private tennis coach at $3,000 per week. They leased luxury condos near the marina. They vacationed in London and St. Bart's. In 6 months, they spent over $800,000. Grief can manifest in strange ways. That was the explanation friends gave. But detectives were starting to look closer. Victor's will had not yet been finalized, and someone had accessed his office computer shortly after the murders. The Navarros had been raised in privilege, but beneath the surface, something darker was about to emerge, and it would change everything. For nearly 7 months after the murders, Adrian and Mateo Navarro lived as if the tragedy had happened to someone else. They gave interviews expressing heartbreak. They thanked the community for support. They spoke about healing and moving forward. Meanwhile, the inheritance process advanced. Behind the scenes, however, the investigation had stalled. Detectives initially pursued Victor Navarro's business dealings. As CEO of Crescent Entertainment Holdings, he had negotiated high-stakes contracts and dissolved partnerships that cost competitors millions. It was plausible he had made enemies, but there were problems with the mob hit theory. No forced entry, no theft, no threatening calls before or after the murders, and the brutality, while extreme, felt personal. Still, without a break, the case drifted. Until Mateo started seeing a psychologist. Dr. Daniel Kessler was a well-known therapist in Santa Valera. Mateo had reportedly been struggling with insomnia, anxiety, and guilt. Adrian attended several sessions too. What happened in that office would change everything. According to later testimony, therapy sessions evolved from grief counseling into something far darker. The brothers began discussing hypothetical scenarios about removing a dominating force from their lives. They talked about fear, control, power. Eventually, the conversation stopped being hypothetical. Mateo confessed. He described planning the murders, buying the shotguns under false pretenses, timing the attack, reloading, staging the scene. Dr. Kessler initially kept the confession confidential, bound by doctor-patient privilege, but there was a complication. He had confided in someone. Kessler was involved in a turbulent relationship with a woman named Marissa Cole. During an argument, she claimed he revealed that his clients had admitted to killing their parents. Marissa went to the police. That single act reopened a case that had been cooling for months. Investigators obtained search warrants, they seized therapy notes, they fought legal battles over whether the taped sessions were admissible. Defense attorneys argued confidentiality protections were absolute. Prosecutors countered that threats of future harm voided privilege. The legal fight dragged on for over a year, but the damage was done. Adrian was arrested first at his Marina condo. Matteo was taken into custody upon returning from a tennis tournament overseas. The image of grieving sons shattered overnight. The prosecution's theory was straightforward: greed. They argued the brothers feared being cut out of the will. Victor had allegedly expressed frustration with Adrian's academic issues and Matteo's lack of discipline. Financial control was tight, allowances monitored, spending scrutinized. Prosecutors claimed the murders were premeditated and motivated by inheritance. The defense unveiled a completely different narrative: abuse. According to the brothers, their father was not just controlling, he was sexually abusive for years. The first trial began in 1994 and became a national spectacle. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom, cable networks aired daily highlights, late-night comedians mocked the emotional testimonies. Adrian testified first. He described being molested between ages 6 and 8. He claimed the abuse escalated from massages after sports practice to forced sexual acts in his bedroom and bathroom. He said he told his mother once. "She told me to stop exaggerating," he testified. Matteo took the stand next. He described continued abuse into his teenage years. He said he was threatened into silence. He said he believed his father would kill him if he told anyone. The courtroom was silent when he spoke. The defense introduced disturbing photographs found among family belongings, images of the boys naked at inappropriate ages. They argued the photos supported long-term abuse. Then came the psychological argument. A forensic psychiatrist testified that the killings were not cold, calculated executions, but the desperate act of traumatized young men who believed their lives were in danger. The expert described imperfect self-defense, the idea that prolonged abuse can distort perception of imminent threat. Prosecutors pushed back aggressively. They pointed to the reloads, the kneecap shots, the movie theater alibi attempt, the spending spree. They argued abused victims do not celebrate with Rolex watches and European vacations. One of the most damaging moments came from Adrian's former friend, Kyle Donovan. In an earlier recorded interview, Donovan had said Adrian confided about abuse long before the murders. On the stand, however, Donovan denied remembering those conversations. The contradiction created chaos. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury deadlocked. Both brothers' juries were hopelessly divided. Mistrial. The nation was split. Talk radio exploded. Opinion pieces flooded newspapers. Were they monsters or were they broken sons failed by the system? The second trial began in 1995. This time, everything changed. No cameras, no live coverage, and crucially, the judge limited testimony regarding sexual abuse. The defense could mention it, but extensive psychological context was restricted. Even more significant, the jury was not allowed to consider voluntary manslaughter as an option, only first-degree murder or acquittal. Adrian chose not to testify again. The prosecution streamlined its case. They focused on planning, weapons purchases, computer data wiping, and financial motive. After just 4 days of deliberation in 1996, the jury returned its verdict: guilty, first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder. 3 weeks later, both were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Hawthorne Ridge mansion was sold. The Navarro name became synonymous with scandal. But even behind bars, the story refused to fade, because years later, new evidence would surface, and the question that divided a generation would resurface. Were Adrian and Mateo Navarro cold-blooded killers, or were they victims who finally snapped? When Adrian and Mateo Navarro were sentenced to life without parole in 1996, most people believed the story was over. 2 privileged sons, a multi-million-dollar inheritance, a brutal double homicide. Justice served. The Hawthorne Ridge estate was sold within a year, the furniture auctioned, the marble floor scrubbed clean of memory. Santa Valera moved on. But the case never really disappeared. Inside the prison system, the brothers were separated. Adrian was sent to Sierra Crest State Prison in Northern California. Mateo was housed nearly 500 miles away at Desert Valley Correctional Facility. For years, their only contact was through letters. Prison life stripped away everything that once defined them. Designer suits were replaced with state-issued uniforms. Private tennis courts became concrete yards. Instead of corporate executives and socialites, they were surrounded by lifers, gang members, and men with nothing left to lose. And yet, something unexpected happened. They adapted. Mateo immersed himself in art programs, painting portraits and landscapes that were later donated to charities supporting trauma survivors. He married a longtime pen pal, building a relationship entirely through correspondence before meeting face-to-face in the prison visiting room. Adrian took a different route. He became involved in inmate advocacy, joining committees focused on prison reform and survivor support groups. He mentored younger inmates and helped organize educational programs. For many jurors who had convicted them, this didn't change the past, but it complicated the narrative. Then, nearly 2 decades after the verdict, something shifted. In 2017, after years of petitions, prison officials approved a transfer request. The brothers were finally housed in the same facility. The reunion was described by correctional staff as deeply emotional. Nearly 20 years apart ended in a single moment in a prison common area. Outside prison walls, the cultural climate had also changed. In the 1990s, discussions about male sexual abuse were rare and often dismissed. Public perception at the time struggled to accept that wealthy teenage boys could be victims of prolonged assault. By the 2010s and 2020s, those conversations were very different. Movements focused on trauma awareness and institutional abuse had reshaped public discourse. Podcasts and streaming documentaries revisited high-profile cases. Social media platforms amplified alternative perspectives. The Navarro case resurfaced. Younger generations began asking questions that jurors in 1996 never fully resolved. What if the abuse allegations were true? What if the brothers' fear was real, even if their response was criminal? Then came new evidence. In 2023, defense attorneys filed a habeas petition citing material that had not been fully considered during the trials. One piece was a letter Mateo had written to his cousin in late 1990, months before the murders. In the letter, he described being afraid of his father and feeling trapped. The wording suggested ongoing abuse and desperation. Prosecutors had previously argued that the abuse narrative was fabricated after the arrests, but a letter written before the crime challenged that claim. Another development came from outside the family entirely. A former teenage performer, now middle-aged, submitted a sworn affidavit alleging that Victor Navarro had assaulted him years earlier while working as an executive at Titan Sound Group. The claim could not be retroactively prosecuted. Victor was dead, but it lent weight to the brothers' long-standing accusations. The prosecution responded cautiously. They argued that even if abuse occurred, it did not justify execution-style killings, and that remains the core legal tension. Self-defense requires imminent threat. Premeditated murder requires planning and intent. The Navarro brothers purchased weapons. They reloaded multiple times. They staged a scene. They went to a movie. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars afterward. Those facts are not disputed. The legal question is whether prolonged trauma can distort perception of danger enough to alter culpability. The public remains divided. Some see two manipulative men who used abuse claims to avoid accountability. Others see damaged sons who believe there was no escape from a powerful, controlling father. Meanwhile, the brothers are no longer the reckless young men who once drove sports cars through Santa Valera. They are middle-aged. They have spent more than 30 decades incarcerated. Supporters argue that even if the murders were intentional, the psychological context warrants resentencing to voluntary manslaughter. Under California law, that could mean they have already served more time than required. Opponents argue that reopening the case would undermine the finality of verdicts and re-traumatize surviving family members. In legal filings, the state has maintained that the evidence presented at trial was sufficient for first-degree murder. Appeals courts have historically been reluctant to overturn jury decisions absent clear procedural error. But cultural shifts matter. Cases once considered closed sometimes reopen when new evidence intersects with evolving standards of justice. The Navarro brothers' petition remains under review. Inside prison, life continues in routine cycles: count, meals, work assignments, lockdowns. They are no longer the faces of televised drama. No cameras follow them. No reporters wait outside the gates. Yet online, their story circulates constantly. Clips of trial testimony resurface. Old courtroom footage is dissected frame by frame. Comment sections debate whether their tears were authentic or rehearsed. The central question has not changed in over 30 years. Were Adrian and Mateo Navarro calculating killers driven by greed? Or were they young men shaped by years of abuse who made a catastrophic decision out of fear? The law answered that question in 1996. History may answer it differently. For now, the brothers remain behind bars. The Hawthorne Ridge mansion belongs to someone else. Victor and Elena Navarro lie buried in a quiet cemetery outside Santa Valera. And the case that once seemed like a simple story of wealth and murder has become something far more complex. Not just a crime, but a mirror reflecting how society understands trauma, power, privilege, and accountability. Whether Adrian and Mateo Navarro ever walk free will depend not only on legal technicalities, but on how courts interpret the intersection between abuse and responsibility. Until then, the debate continues, and the story refuses to die. The fire started just after midnight on the edge of a quiet town called Briar Hollow, where the trees leaned close to the houses as if listening to secrets. By the time the first engine from the volunteer department turned onto Alder Street, flames were already climbing out of the second-floor windows of the Caldwell home, bright and hungry against the dark sky. The neighbors stood barefoot in their yards, arms folded tight, watching the roof blister and cave. Inside, the firefighters found him in the upstairs study. Thomas Caldwell had been a respected man in Briar Hollow. He owned a small hardware store on Main Street. He donated to the church roof fund. He coached Little League one season before quitting because, as he told everyone, he was too busy. He was found slumped behind his desk, not burned beyond recognition, but dead long before the flames reached him. The coroner would later confirm what the fire chief already suspected. Thomas Caldwell had been shot. Down on the curb, wrapped in thin gray blankets, sat his two sons. Mason, 18, stared straight ahead, his face empty in a way that did not match the chaos around him. Noah, 16, was shaking so hard one of the paramedics thought he was in shock. They told the police they had done it. No hesitation, no lawyer, no story about a masked intruder or a robbery gone wrong. "We shot him," Mason said flatly, as if admitting to breaking a window. Noah nodded. "We poured the gasoline. We lit it." The words landed like stones. Detective Rowan Hale arrived 20 minutes later. He had been with Briar Hollow PD for 14 years, long enough to know that simple confessions in complicated scenes rarely meant what they appeared to mean. He studied the boys carefully. There was no blood on their clothes, no soot on their hands. Their eyes looked dazed but not wild. Mason's expression in particular struck him as strange. Not grief, not fear, not relief. It was closer to resignation. Inside the charred study, Hale crouched beside the body and let the silence speak. The bullet wound was clean, close range, one shot to the chest, professional or lucky. He glanced at the shattered whiskey glass on the desk and the faint smell of accelerant clinging to the carpet. The fire had been set deliberately, yes, but it had been set sloppily. Gasoline had pooled unevenly. The burn pattern suggested hesitation. That did not fit Mason's steady voice. Back outside, Hale approached the boys again. "Why?" he asked. Mason looked at him calmly. "He was hurting us." Noah flinched at the word hurting. "In what way?" Hale pressed. Mason's jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter now." It mattered very much. By morning, Briar Hollow had already chosen its sides. Some believed the boys. Thomas Caldwell had always been private, strict. There had been whispers about shouting late at night. A former employee once said Thomas had a temper that could crack glass. Others refused to believe it. "Those boys had everything," one neighbor told the local reporter. "Private school, new truck. That man worked himself to death for them." But there was someone missing from the scene that night, someone the boys had mentioned in passing during their second interview, Elias Vance. When Detective Hale heard the name, he paused. Vance lived 3 miles out town in a renovated farmhouse surrounded by tall fencing and locked gates. He was in his early 50s, wealthy in a vague way no one could quite explain. He claimed to be an investor. He drove a dark sedan that was always spotless. He attended charity galas but never stayed long. Most importantly, he had become very close to the Caldwell family over the past year, close to the boys in particular. "He understood us," Noah said during questioning, his voice small. "He said he could see what was happening." "What was happening?" Hale asked. Noah looked at Mason before answering. Dad was different behind closed doors. The official interview stretched into hours. Mason repeated the same structure every time. Their father was abusive. They had planned the shooting for weeks. They bought the gun illegally from a classmate. They poured gasoline from the lawnmower can. They acted alone. The repetition was flawless, too flawless. Hale had interviewed enough suspects to recognize rehearsal when he heard it. Later that afternoon, Hale drove out to Elias Vance's property. The gate was already open. Vance greeted him on the porch with a composed half-smile, wearing pressed jeans and a navy sweater. He looked like a man expecting company. "Detective," he said smoothly. "Terrible tragedy." "You were close with the Caldwell boys," Hale said. Vance nodded. "Mentored them, really. Thomas asked me to. Mason especially had potential." "Where were you last night?" "At home," Vance replied without blinking. "Alone. You're welcome to check my security system." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the house. Inside, everything felt curated. Minimalist furniture, clean lines, no clutter. The kind of home where nothing accidental was allowed to exist. On a side table sat a framed photograph. Mason and Noah standing beside Vance at a lake, both smiling widely. No sign of their father. "You've been spending a lot of time with them," Hale said. "They needed guidance," Vance replied gently. "Thomas could be harsh." The word echoed. Harsh. Not abusive, not violent, just harsh. Hale watched the man carefully. Vance's tone never shifted. No tremor, no anger, no grief. Just control. "Did the boys ever talk about hurting their father?" Hale asked. Vance hesitated for half a second, not long enough for most people to notice. "They were upset," he said. "Teenagers can exaggerate." "And you never encouraged them." A faint smile touched Vance's lips. "Of course not." Hale left with more questions than answers. Back at the station, the forensic report came in. There were no gunshot residue traces on Mason or Noah's hands. None. That did not mean they hadn't fired the weapon. Washing thoroughly could remove it. Time could reduce it. But combined with their clean clothes and strangely composed statements, the absence felt heavy. The gasoline can recovered from the garage carried partial fingerprints. Not just the boys, a third set. When Hale saw that, he leaned back slowly in his chair. He ordered a quiet comparison against known prints in the system. While he waited, he reviewed the security footage from nearby homes. At 11:42 p.m., a dark sedan had been seen turning onto Alder Street. The quality was poor, but the shape was familiar. At 12:09 p.m., the same sedan drove away. Mason and Noah called 911 at 12:15 p.m. Too calm, too precise. That evening, Hale returned to the holding room where the brothers sat together. "You said you planned this alone," he began. Mason met his gaze steadily. "We did." "Then how does it look like someone else was there?" Noah's breathing changed instantly. Mason did not move. "There wasn't," Mason said. Hale placed a photograph of the dark sedan on the table. Silence. Then Hale added one more piece. "We found another set of fingerprints on the gasoline can." For the first time, Mason's expression cracked, just slightly, a flicker in his eyes. Noah whispered, barely audible. "He said he'd protect us." Hale leaned forward. "Who?" Mason closed his eyes. Outside, thunder rolled over Briar Hollow. The storm that had been building all day finally broke, rain slamming against the station windows like a warning. When Mason spoke again, his voice had changed. "We didn't come up with it." The case had just shifted, and somewhere beyond town limits, in a farmhouse with locked gates and carefully arranged furniture, Elias Vance sat in the dark, listening to the rain, waiting to see whether the boys would hold the line. By the time the storm cleared over Briar Hollow, the story had already split into two competing truths. In one version, Mason and Noah Caldwell were desperate sons who ended years of hidden cruelty. In the other, they were manipulated boys pulled into something far more calculated than grief or rage. Detective Rowan Hale no longer believed in the clean confession. He believed in design. The fingerprint analysis came back first. The partial print on the gasoline can was not a match in any criminal database. That alone was telling. Whoever it belonged to had either never been arrested or had been careful enough to avoid records. But Hale had anticipated that. He obtained a warrant for voluntary fingerprint comparison under the pretext of eliminating peripheral contacts. Elias Vance agreed without hesitation. That was his first mistake. The match was not perfect. The print was partial, smudged along one edge, but ridge detail aligned in 12 distinct points. Forensic standard required fewer for probable identification. It was enough. Vance had handled the gasoline can. Hale did not move immediately. Instead, he reconstructed the timeline. Security footage from 2 additional homes confirmed the same dark sedan circling the block twice before parking briefly out of camera range. Cell tower data placed Vance's phone within a half-mile radius of the Caldwell house at 11:38 p.m. At 11:44 p.m., his phone powered off. It powered back on at 12:18 a.m., 3 miles away, near his farmhouse. Mason and Noah called 911 at 12:15. The sequencing was too tight to ignore. But the question remained, why would 2 brothers confess to a murder they did not solely execute? The answer began to surface in Mason's 3rd interview. Hale separated the brothers this time. Noah broke first. "He said it was the only way," Noah whispered, fingers twisting in his hoodie sleeve. "He said Dad would never stop." "Did he tell you to shoot your father?" Hale asked evenly. Noah shook his head violently. "He said we had to make a decision. He said strong people act." Language matters in manipulation. Hale knew that. The manipulator rarely gives a direct order. He frames inevitability. He reframes morality. Mason's interview was colder. "He didn't force us," Mason said. "He just helped us see." "See what?" "That we were trapped." Hale let the silence stretch. Mason eventually continued. "He'd talk about power, about breaking cycles, about how some people are obstacles." "And your father was an obstacle?" Mason did not answer. Instead, he asked a question of his own. "If someone teaches you how to think, is that a crime?" It was not a teenage question. It was a rehearsed philosophical defense. Hale requested digital forensics on Vance's devices. The farmhouse search warrant was executed at dawn. Inside, officers found no weapons matching the caliber used in Thomas Caldwell's shooting, no obvious accelerants, no blood traces. What they did find was subtler: encrypted messaging apps, deleted chat histories partially recoverable, notes stored under innocuous file names. One folder contained structured outlines titled Dependency Formation, Isolation Reinforcement, Authority Reframing. Hale read through the documents slowly. They were not explicit instructions for murder. They were psychological frameworks, essays on influence, discussions of emotional leverage, case studies from obscure behavioral research journals. Vance had studied control extensively. In the recovered fragments of chat logs between Vance and Mason, patterns emerged. You deserve autonomy. You are not powerless. You are capable of decisive action. If a structure is corrupt, it must be dismantled. Never once did Vance write, "Kill him." He did not need to. The final night's exchange was short. Mason, "It has to end." Vance, "Then end it." Mason, "Tonight." Vance, "I trust your strength." That message was sent at 10:52 p.m., 2 hours before the fire. The community response shifted when details leaked. Parents who once admired Vance's mentorship began revisiting their own interactions. A mother recalled him offering private guidance sessions for her son after a minor disciplinary issue. Another remembered him suggesting that traditional authority structures were psychologically limiting. Briar Hollow had not noticed the architecture forming around them. Vance never isolated the boys physically. He isolated them ideologically. He validated their resentment. He reframed their father's strictness as oppression. He positioned himself as the only adult who truly understood them. When Hale finally brought Vance in for formal questioning, the room felt different from the boys' interviews. There was no trembling, no cracks, only composure. "You handled the gasoline can." Vance folded his hands calmly. "I've been in their garage before. That proves nothing. You were near the house the night Thomas Caldwell died. I often drive at night. It helps me think. You told Mason you trusted his strength." Vance gave a slight smile. "Encouragement is not conspiracy." Hale leaned forward. "Did you fire the weapon?" "No." "Did you hand it to him?" "No." "Did you intend for Thomas Caldwell to die?" Vance paused. Intent is difficult to prove when phrased carefully. "He intended for those boys to free themselves," he said. It was the closest he would come to admission. Ballistics returned a partial answer days later. The weapon had been purchased illegally by Mason through a classmate, as he had stated. Surveillance from a gas station confirmed Mason meeting the seller weeks earlier. But gunshot residue patterns inside the study told a more complex story. There were two distinct height trajectories for particulate dispersion, one consistent with Mason's height, the other several inches taller. Thomas Caldwell had not been shot once. He had been shot twice. The second bullet had lodged itself in the bookcase behind him, previously obscured by fire damage. The boys had confessed to one shot. When Hale presented this to Mason, the facade fractured. "I didn't see him fire," Mason said hoarsely. "I heard it." "You were in the room," Hale said. Mason nodded slowly. "He said I had to do it first," he whispered, "to prove I meant it." "And the second shot?" Mason closed his eyes. "He said it was mercy." Arrest warrants were issued that evening. Elias Vance was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and homicide under accomplices' liability. As officers led him from the farmhouse, he did not resist. He did not protest. He did not appear surprised. Reporters shouted questions. "Did you manipulate those boys? Are you a cult leader? Did you kill Thomas Caldwell?" Vance stopped briefly before entering the patrol vehicle. "I gave them clarity," he said calmly. "They made a choice. The trial would hinge on that sentence. Choice versus coercion. Influence versus instruction. Freedom versus design." Back in his cell, Mason finally cried for the first time since the fire. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quietly as the weight of autonomy settled in. Noah refused to speak at all. Detective Hale reviewed the case file one last time before submitting it to the district attorney. He knew the defense would argue shared responsibility, that Mason pulled the trigger first, that no one forced his hand. They would be correct. But Hale also understood something juries struggle to articulate. When a mind is methodically reshaped, the line between decision and direction blurs. Elias Vance had never needed to shout commands. He had constructed inevitability, and in Briar Hollow, inevitability had burned a house to the ground. The trial of Elias Vance began 9 months after the fire, and by then Briar Hollow had grown tired of talking about it, though no one had truly stopped thinking about it. The Caldwell house had been demolished. A flat patch of dirt remained where the structure once stood, as if the town hoped erasing the building might erase the memory. It did not. The prosecution's theory was precise. Elias Vance identified vulnerability in 2 adolescent boys. He isolated them psychologically from their father. He reframed authority as oppression. He nurtured resentment until violence felt not only justified but necessary. Then he positioned himself at the scene to ensure the act was completed and concealed. They did not call him a mastermind, they called him an architect. The defense strategy was equally focused. Mason Caldwell purchased the gun. Mason pulled the trigger. Mason admitted to pouring gasoline. No document, no recording, no witness could prove Vance explicitly ordered a murder. Encouragement, they argued, is not conspiracy. Philosophy is not homicide. On the third day of testimony, Mason took the stand. He looked older than 18. Jail has a way of compressing youth. His voice, once flat and controlled, now carried something heavier. "Yes," he said when the prosecutor asked if he shot his father, "I fired first." "And why?" Mason hesitated. "Because I believed it was the only way to stop him." "Who gave you that belief?" The courtroom went still. "No one forced me," Mason said carefully, "but Mr. Vance, he helped me see things differently." The prosecutor did not press further. He let the phrasing settle. "Helped me see." When the defense cross-examined, they circled that sentence repeatedly. "Mr. Caldwell, did Elias Vance ever say the words, 'Kill your father'?" "No." "Did he ever hand you the weapon?" "No." "Did he ever threaten you?" "No." "So you made your own decision." Mason swallowed. "Yes." Across the room, Vance watched with an expression that never quite shifted. Not pride, not fear, something closer to clinical interest. Noah testified next, though more reluctantly. He said strong people act. He said waiting was weakness. Did he say act how? The defense attorney pressed. Noah shook his head. He didn't have to. The prosecution introduced the recovered messages, the fingerprint match, the cell tower data, the second bullet trajectory. They built their case on accumulation, not one piece definitive, together persuasive. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, a former mentee. 18-year-old Lucas Brenner approached the stand with visible anxiety. He'd attended Vance's leadership sessions the year prior. He'd talk about breaking systems, about how rules are illusions created by weak people. He'd say sometimes destruction is the only path to growth. "Did he ever tell you to hurt someone?" the defense objected. "No," Lucas admitted, "but he made it sound logical." Logical. That word resurfaced repeatedly. The trial became less about what he did and more about what he constructed. Closing arguments lasted nearly 4 hours. The prosecution spoke first. "Conspiracy does not require a shouted command," the district attorney told the jury. "It requires intent and participation." Elias Vance participated. He was present. He handled the accelerant. He fired the second shot. He shaped the mental landscape in which this crime became inevitable. The defense rose slowly. "We are not here to criminalize influence. We are not here to punish unpopular ideas." Mason Caldwell admitted under oath that he chose to pull the trigger. You cannot convict a man because his words were persuasive. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In Briar Hollow, businesses closed early the afternoon the verdict was announced. People gathered outside the courthouse steps, not chanting, not shouting, just waiting. Inside, the air felt compressed. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of arson, guilty. On the charge of second-degree murder under accomplice liability, guilty. There was no audible reaction from Vance when the verdict was read. He simply exhaled once slowly and nodded as if acknowledging a calculated risk. Sentencing followed 6 weeks later. Mason received 25 years with eligibility for parole after 15, reduced due to cooperation and age at the time of the offense. Noah, adjudicated as a minor participant, received 8 years in a juvenile facility, transitioning to supervised release. Elias Vance was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. When asked if he wished to speak, he stood. "I never held the gun to their hands," he said calmly. "I taught them to think critically. If that is a crime, then the system is more fragile than I imagined." The judge did not respond. He simply finalized the sentence. Years passed. Briar Hollow adjusted in the quiet way small towns do. A new family eventually purchased the vacant lot and built a modest house, though some neighbors still avoided looking at it after dark. Detective Rowan Hale retired 2 years after the trial. He never fully shook the case. In interviews with younger officers, he described it not as a murder investigation, but as a study in incremental influence. "You won't always find a smoking gun," he would say. "Sometimes you'll find a philosophy." Mason spent his early 20s in prison education programs. Records show he completed coursework in psychology. Some interpreted that as irony, others saw it as reflection. In one monitored phone call later, he told Noah, "I keep thinking about the moment before. There was a second where I could have walked away." Noah replied quietly, "He made it feel like walking away wasn't real." That sentence never made headlines, but it lingered. Elias Vance's appeals were methodical and persistent. He challenged procedural issues. He questioned evidentiary thresholds. He argued that intellectual influence cannot constitute criminal liability without explicit directive. Each appeal was denied. In prison, he maintained the same composure reported during trial. He read extensively. He wrote essays. He reportedly mentored other inmates, though under strict supervision. The architecture did not disappear. It simply found smaller rooms. The Caldwell case is still discussed in legal seminars as a study of coercive persuasion and accomplice liability, not because it was the most violent crime in state history, but because it exposed a gray area most people prefer to ignore. How much responsibility belongs to the hand that pulls the trigger? How much belongs to the voice that made it feel justified? In Briar Hollow, the answers remain uncomfortable. On quiet nights, when the street lights hum and the wind moves through the trees, Alder Street looks like any other road. Children ride bikes, dogs bark behind fences, porch lights flicker on at dusk. But there is a subtle awareness beneath the surface, a recognition that influence can be slow, patient, and almost invisible, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a room is not the gun. It is the idea that someone else has already decided what you must do.